Alright, thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about percents and different applications of that. And in order to be able to do that, we need to know what a percent is. And a percent, as you guys would know, it is a grade. You like to get your grades. That usually comes in a percentage. It's simply a number that is a ratio of 100, something out of 100. So for example, you can see down at the bottom 20%. That's typically how we write percents. That's the percent symbol at the end there. This can be written as 20 over 100. A number out of 100. That's what that definition above means. So 35% would be 35 over 100. Okay, so let's look at some examples of what you'll be asked to do. First of which would be simple conversions, or maybe not simple, but conversions nonetheless. Converting 45% to a fraction. In order to do that, you have to revert back to what we just mentioned. Every percentage is out of 100. So a percentage is actually already a fraction. It's just not written in that way. So we take whatever the number is in the percent, and we simply take that and put it over 100. At this point, you need to use your skills of simplifying. All right, so you would have to be able to simplify a fraction. In order to simplify, you look at the numerator and the denominator, and you find a common number that divides evenly into both. Now the number has to be the same number, and it has to divide into both. So since 45 ends in a 5 and 100 ends in a 0, using our divisibility rules, we can see that 5 would go in evenly. 5 goes into 45 9 times, and 5 goes into 100. If you're not sure how many times, you simply come over, do a little scratch math off to the side to be sure. 5 ends up going into 10 2 times. And it goes into 0. Once we subtract, we get 0. Bring down the 0. You can see that you end up with 20 because 5 doesn't go into 0. So we get a clean 20 there, and we see that we end up with 9/20. So that's how you would convert 45% to a fraction. Now again, 45% as a fraction initially is 45 over 100. However, depending on, and typically, your teacher is going to ask you to simplify. So 9 over 20 would be your fully simplified percentage, or fraction in this case, of that percentage. Next, we're going to convert 80%. So again, initially we can simply take 80 and put that over 100, just as we did before. And then we look to simplify. Think of what number can go in evenly to both 80 and 100. Well, because they both end in 0, we know that 10 can go into them evenly. So in this case, we're going to divide 80 by 10, which would give us 8. And we're going to divide 100 by 10, which would give us 10. Okay, now the issue you run into here is that these are both even numbers. 8 and 10 are both even, which means they can still simplify. So it is possible your initial division or initial value that you choose doesn't simplify it all the way down. So you need to look to another value. In this case, we know 2 can go into both 8 and 10. So 2 goes into 8 4 times, and 2 goes into 10 5 times. And you can see now that we end up with 4/5. It's converted to a fraction that can no longer simplify. So 4/5 would be your completely simplified version of 80% in fraction form. Next, we're going to convert in converting a percent to a fraction, now we're going to go the other direction, fraction to percent. So converting 1/8 to a percent, we're going to use similar tactics, except for this time we're going to have to use division. Okay, and dividing 1/8 into itself ultimately, or I should say 1/8 as 8 into 1. You should always take the denominator, and I'm going to write this out so you can see. You're always going to take the denominator in the fraction and divide it into the numerator. So if I was to write that out so that we can do the math using our division sign, it would be 8 into 1. And I know you're probably thinking, well, that can't work. Well, what you end up having to do here is include a decimal, because you're right, 8 doesn't go into 1, not evenly. So what we have to do is include a decimal and include a 0. Okay, we're basically adding numeric places now so that we can actually do the division. 8 goes into 10 one time. So 1 times 8 is 8. And we're going to have 2 left over. We're going to have to bring down a 0. And I may run out of room here. Let me redo that over to the side. 8 and 2. All right. So we're going to subtract. We're going to end up with 2 there. Move my decimal up. And now we're going to have to include a 0 because we can see that didn't come out evenly. So we include a 0 and bring that down. Again, those are just more place values, so we can continue the division. 8 goes into 20 2 times. 2 times 8 is 16, which leaves us with a remainder of 4. Once again, we can't stop here because we're trying to close it out or see if there is a repetition. So now there is no repetition as of yet, so we're going to have to go ahead and include one more place value of a 0 and bring that down. 8 goes into 40 5 times. So 5 times 8 gives us 40, and we see that we finally finished off our division. So at this point, what we have here is a decimal of 0.125. So now what we need to remember is how to convert a decimal to a percent. And to do that is pretty simple actually. You just move your decimal place 2 places to the right. Every time, it's always 2 places to the right, no matter what. So in this case, you're going to end up with 12.5%. You can see originally it was 0.125, and now by moving the decimal, we get 12.5, 2 places to the right. So let's move down to the bottom. Converting 3/5 to a percent, we're going to, again, do the same exact thing as before. You're actually dividing the denominator into the numerator again. So your setup would be 5 into 3. So again, as you notice, a lot of these you're going to have to include a decimal. That won't always be the case. It is possible to have a percentage that's over 100. But in this case, we will have to include a decimal. Let's move that straight up into our solution and include a place value of a 0. And we can see now that 5 goes into 30 6 times. Now, unlike the last example, this one worked out nice and easy. We can see that came out nice and easy to be 0. So we're looking at 0.6 as our decimal. So using the same strategy as before to create a percent, now we need to move our decimal 2 places to the right. Now I realize that there is no number after the 6. You have to include a value, which of course is going to be 0. So we move that decimal 2 places, whether there are 2 places or not. You have to include that place. So that ends up being 60%. 60 then decimal. So 60% would be your solution to that problem. Next, converting a percent to a decimal. Well, we kind of just did that in a way, okay? However, to convert this 32% to a decimal, we're going to just write it without the percentage sign. So we're going to just write 32, okay? And we have to remember where decimals initially are in numbers. A decimal in a whole number is always going to be after the ones place. In this case, we have our tens place, we have our ones place. So that means the decimal is going to always be directly after that ones place. It's separating the whole values from your decimal values. So in this case, there is a decimal in 32%. It's just after the 2. It won't typically be there. So looking at 32 now, we need to use a similar strategy, but because we're going from a decimal, from a percent to a decimal, we're going to move the decimal the other direction. So it is here. We're going to move it to the left 2 places. So it's really determined by which way you're converting. If you're converting one way, you have to move it 2 places to the right. If you're converting in this manner, you have to move it 2 places to the left, which is going to then give you your final answer of 0.32. In the grand scheme of things, not terribly difficult. It's just hard to remember the details of when to do which. So if we look at the next example, we have 42.5%. So again, this time, they gave us a decimal. So that's easy to find. No matter whether the decimal is in your initial percentage or not, okay, you're still going to move it 2 places to the left, okay, when you're converting a percentage to a decimal. So we're going to move it 1, 2 places to the left, just like that. And that's going to give us then 0.425. And again, sometimes you'll see that 0 out there holding the place of your whole number values, or the ones place. And that's all that you would have to do to convert that one. All right, and then we would get into some word problems. And these word problems, and for finding a percent of a whole. Again, a lot of these percentage problems can be solved with simple multiplication. However, you can also use what we call proportions. My suggestion for a problem like this, when you're looking in a pet store, 40% of the pets are dogs. If there are 250 pets, how many of them are dogs? You're looking for what percent out of the total number of pets. Use multiplication. You're looking at 40%. Now the key to this problem here is that percentage. You can't do math with a percent. You have to convert it to a decimal first. So we need to first convert 40%. We'll do off to the side here, which is 40 and then a decimal. We're going to convert that to what it should be in order to be able to do math, which is 2 places to the left. We move our decimal 0.4 or 0.40. Now you can simply write it as 0.4. You don't need to include the 0 unless you want to. So we're actually looking at 250 pets total, and we're going to use multiplication here. What you have to remember here, it may seem like you use division, but by multiplying by a decimal, you technically are dividing. All right. That sounds nice and confusing, I'm sure, but you'll notice that your final value here actually goes down, which means we did divide. So 0.4 times 250. And in problems like this, you will always use multiplication. So 250 times 0.4, we're going to go ahead. In this case, we don't have to really worry about the decimal right away. 4 times 0 is 0. 4 times 5 is 20, so carry the 2. 4 times 2 is 8, plus that 2 is going to give us 10. And then now is where we have to worry about the decimal. We see that we actually have 1 decimal place. In our final solution here, we have these numbers. Okay, the initial decimal is always at the end of your answer. You have to move that decimal to the left the same number of times the decimal shows up in your initial problem, or the same number of decimal places. This has 1 decimal place in it. Okay, 0.4, just 1 decimal movement. So we're going to move our decimal in our solution 1 place. So we're actually going from 1,000 to 100. Okay, 1,000 to 100. So that means that there are 100 dogs at this store. Next, finding a percent of a whole, same problem. So if you want to try to work this one on your own while I walk through it, you can try that. In a survey of 300 students, 35% of them said they prefer football to basketball. How many students prefer football? So again, we're going to be looking at a total number, 300, which will be multiplied by our percentage. But again, we can't multiply by that as a percent. We need to modify it to its decimal form. So that will be 35. Where our decimal is at the end of the 5, we're going to move it 2 places to the left. So where you see we're going to actually multiply by 0.35 in order to solve this problem. So in this case, we go ahead and start dividing. 5 times 0 is 0. 5 times 0 again is 0. 5 times 3 is 15. Carry the or hold the place. You can leave it blank, or as I like to do, just put a 0 there. Then we'll multiply by 3. 3 times 0 is 0. 3 times 0 again is 0. And then 3 times 3 is 9. Go ahead and add those up. And you see that we get, in this case, initially you get 10,500. Okay? But as we saw with the last problem, we have to do something with the initial decimal that we had in the problem, which was 0.35. 0.35 has 2 decimal places. 1, 2, and it's really just counting the numbers that come before the decimal. In the last example, there was 1 number, which was a 4, so that was only 1 decimal place. In this problem, there's 2, a 3 and a 5, then the decimal. So that's 2 places we need to move our decimal, 1, 2, giving us 105. Okay, so how many students prefer football? 105. All right, now we're going to take a look at some problems that involve what I call is over of. Okay, when I say is over of, I'm referring to a fraction, is over of. And we're actually going to use the concept of a proportion to solve these. I use a proportion because it's something that will help you out later on, because you will use them quite often to solve other types of problems. So, when looking at this first example here, we're looking at what is 12% of 350. So we're going to use the words is and of that are part of the problem to help us set up our proportion. Now, based off of what we learned earlier, we already know that 12% in fraction form is 12 over 100. So now what we're going to do to set up the other half of our proportion, because again, a proportion is two fractions set equal to each other. To set up the other part, we're going to use this strategy that I call is over of. And you need to look at the problem and determine what values are closest to is and closest to of. Well, we can see here that 350 is closest to of. So that means it's going to go in the denominator. All right. The only thing that is closest to is that's an actual value is 12%, but we've already used that. So the word what then means we have an unknown. That is actually the value we're looking for. In math, when we have an unknown, we use a variable. I'm going to use x. So your initial setup would be 12 over 100 equals x over 350. If you've never solved a proportion before, you will need to use what is called cross multiplication. That is definitely the easiest way to solve them. However, you can also look to determine how both of these fractions would simplify. In this case, that would probably be a little bit too complicated. So what we're going to do is use the process of cross multiplication. And to do that, what you will do is start with the bottom left number, which is 100, and you're going to multiply across the equal sign, in this case, to x. So what is 100 times x? Well, it's 100x. And then we'll put equals. You're going to use the same strategy for the other two numbers. You're going to use, it's called cross multiplication for a reason. You're going to multiply across 12 times 350. All right, so of course we're going to have to do a little scratch math off to the side here. Whoops. So we'll do 350 times 12 to determine what that will be. So 2 times 0 is 0. 2 times 5 is 10. Carry your 1. 2 times 3 is 6. Plus 1 is 7. Then you're going to hold the place and do the same thing with 1. 1 times 0 is 1. 1 times 5 is 5. And 1 times 3 is 3. All right, now we add all of that up and we get 0, 0, 12. Carry your 1. 3 plus 1 is 4. So 4,200. All right, when you look at 100x equals 4,200, this is technically an equation. If you haven't learned to solve equations yet, you will learn that later on. To solve this, what you will do is what we call inverse operations. You can also simply look at x and try to determine what times 100 would give you 4,200. That's another way to look at it. Mathematically, as a teacher, what we would like you to do is solve it as an equation. To solve this equation, you will divide by 100 to the left side, and what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So you will also divide 4,200 by 100. In doing that, 100 divided by 100 actually cancels out to 1. That becomes 1x. All right, to divide 4,200 by 100, you will probably have to do that off to the side. So 100 goes into 420 would be your first option, which would be 4 times, giving you 400. You do your subtraction there, and you get 20, and then you need to bring down your 0. 100 goes into 200 2 times, and that's going to go in evenly. I kind of run out of room there, but that's fine. We can see that we're going to end up with x equals 42. After you divide, that is your value that you're looking for. X equals 42 means that 12% of 350 is 42. Oh, whoops. One more example there. All right, so the next example is what is 25% of 150? We're going to use the same strategy, the is over of strategy. So let's first look at, well, we can initially set up our percentage, which would be 25 over 100, because we know the percentage is always going to go over 100. Now we need to figure out how to set up the other half of our proportion. So again, 150 is directly next to of. That's going to go in the denominator. What is directly next to is, which means we don't know that value. So we use a variable. In this case, I'll use x again. And then we're back to where we were before, where we need to use cross multiplication. So we're going to multiply 100 times x, which gives us 100x. And then for the other half of our equation, we will multiply 25 times 150. All right, so a little bit more math to be done there. So we're going to do 150 times 25. So 5 times 0 is 0. 5 times 5 is 25. Going to carry the 2. 5 times 1 is 5 plus 2 is 7. Bring down a 0. 2 times 0 is 0. 2 times 5 is 10. Carry your 1. And 2 times 1 is 2 plus 1 is 3. So we add those up, and pretty easy addition there because of all those zeros. We end up with 3,750. So again, we're now left to solve the equation. And again, it's very repetitive. You will do the same things over and over again. So just like before, you'll notice we're dividing by 100 to both sides, because again, what you do to one side to isolate your variable, you have to do to the other. So in this case, you end up with x equals, we got to do that division. We have 100 and 3750. So 100 goes into 375 3 times. When we do the subtraction there, we get 75. We bring down that last 0. 100 goes into 750 7 times. And that's going to give us 700. All right. And you can see that you have 5 left over, or 50, excuse me. So you would need to add a decimal and bring down a 0. All right. Hopefully you can see now 100 goes into 500 how many times? 5 times. So that would complete the problem at 37.5. Okay, so again, what that means is 25% of 150 would be 37.5. Now, the other style of problem you can see is really just determined by the wording and the values that they give you. In this case, you have 96 is 40% of what number? So they've kind of just changed the order in which and the values that they're giving you. Really just the order. So in this case, we're going to use the same strategy. The is over of strategy. 96 is 40% of what number? Again, the good news is we know how to do the percentage. The percentage is going to be 40 over 100 for the first side of our proportion. Now we can see that 96 is directly next to is. So we know then, because we use the strategy is over of, that 96 will go on top. And because what is directly next to of, what number, that means that our variable or unknown goes on the bottom. And then it's time to cross multiply again. So we're going to start by multiplying by our variable. X times 40 across the equal sign is going to give you 40x. And then the same thing to the other side, 100 times 96. So off to the side there, you'll have to do a little scratch math. 100 times 96, 006. Hold the place, and then you'll have 0, 0, 9. All right, and then we'll add those up and you get 9,600. So 40x will be equal to 9,600. So we're looking for that value of x, which would be multiplied by 40. That gives us 9,600. So in order to determine that, again, we use inverse operations. 40 times x, the inverse of multiplication is division, which is why we continually use division here. So we're looking at dividing by 40 to both sides, because what you do to one side to make this 1x, we have to do to the other. So that's going to become 1x equals. So we'll do a little division over here. 40 into 9,600. So 40 goes into 96. Just based off of estimation alone, we can probably assume it's going to be 2 times, because 2 times 40 is going to be 80. So 2 times 40 gives us our 80. We subtract and we get 16. Bring down the 0. And because 4 times 40 gives us 160, we know that that's going to be 4. So that's going to give us 160. Now don't stop there, because we still do have a 0. Bring that down. 40 goes into 0 0 times, and that's going to be our final solution, 240. So x equals 240, which means 96 is 40% of 240. All right, and then the next one here, 85 is 20% of what number? We're going to follow the same steps. So my suggestion to you is to try it out on your own. If you get stuck, then you can follow along. 85 is 20% of what number? So again, we know the percentage portion is going to be 20 over 100. Always over 100 for a percentage. All right. There we go. Clean that up just a bit. All right, and we have then 85 is, which since it's directly next to is, that goes on top, is over of. And of what number? Of what number, again, refers to our unknown, which is, in this case, a variable. I use x. So now we're going to use cross multiplication. Again, 20 times x across the equal sign gives us 20x. And then we're going to do the other direction, 100 times 85. And if you didn't notice yet, or if you haven't noticed in math, when you multiply by 10 or 100, really all you have to do is add that number of zeros to the end of the number. So in this case, you're going to end up with 8,500. Now, in case you aren't sure about that, you can always multiply it out. All right, so again, it's 0, 0, 5, 0, 0, 5. Hold the place with a 0, and then 0, 0, 8. And you can see we end up with 8,500. It's a nice little trick to know to save you a bit of time. So now we have to finish the problem off by dividing. So again, we're dividing because that's the inverse of this multiplication. Again, in this problem, that means 20 times x. The inverse of multiplication, division. So we're dividing 20 by itself, which means we also have to go to the other side and divide 8,500 by 20. So now, once we do that division, we'll have our answer. So we'll do 20 into 8,500. So we know that 2 can go into 8 4 times, so that means 20 can go into 85 4 times. So we're left with 80. And that's going to give us 5 left over. Bring down a 0. 20 goes into 50. That's going to be 2 times. And that's going to give us 10 left over. We bring down that last 0, and we'll find that 20 goes into 100. 20 goes into 100 5 times. And that's going to be your final solution, 425, because 5 times 20 is 100, and it's going to even out there at the end for us. So what that means then is that 425 is going to be what 20%. 85 is 20% of what number? 20% of 425 then gives you 85. All right, and that has been percents. Thank you for joining me.